Hi guys, hope everyone's well and welcome back to the Improvement Podcast. So today I'm going to be touching on picking your quad movements and basically talking through what you want to look for when picking a movement to target your quads if you're wanting to build maximal muscle there. And a quick update on myself to start off with. So I've reached a new low weight today of 179.6 pounds, which is quite exciting for myself. It's the lightest I've been in coming up 2 years. So yeah. Oh yeah, it is the lightest I've been in 2 years, which is exciting. And it is exciting because this is about the leanest I've been. With obviously doing my last diet beforehand, I stopped that at 180 pounds, so I've just creeped below what I finished the last diet at. And as well as that, like I said, that's kind of, I've not really done much dieting phases. I've not really got super lean before. And the reason being is because my priority's been on growing, because I wanted to have as much muscle as possible for when I started competing. Stepped on stage, yes, it's obviously not as enjoyable not being lean, but it's what you have to do if you want to make the most of your training, if you want to make the most progress you can. So yes, getting exciting for myself, and still got plenty to come off though. Still got, this is just an estimate, but another 19 pounds or so to come off. And yeah, devolume week this week in training, which simply means I'm only doing one working set per exercise. And the reason being is just to drop some fatigue, drop some tiredness. Sometimes you need to pull back when you're pushing all the time, or you're just going to run yourself into the ground. So, in terms of why I decided to create this episode, it's something I struggled with for a good while. I knew, alright, squat will work my legs, that will work my quads, but I didn't know the ins and out of how to actually target the quads as effectively as possible. And if you don't, the reason why you want to know is because if not, you're kind of shooting in the wind. You're not guaranteed to build muscle effectively in that area if you aren't doing it in a approach that works, if that makes sense. Yes, you can just squat and you can just kind of train hard and get places. You can, because effort gets you pretty far. It got me pretty far, and I built decent legs doing that, I believe, but only get you so far anyway. And in terms of jumping into talking about how to grow the quad, so when we think about what the role of it is, which is kind of something we need to learn first, because if we don't know what its job is, if we don't know what the quad's role is, then how can we pick movements? We need to know what the role of the quad is. And it is to extend the leg, so simply straightening your leg. And obviously, there's more to it than that, but what we basically want to do as a result is basically bend the leg as much as possible, because if the leg is fully bent and we fully extend it, that's us taking our quad through a full range of motion, which is what we're after, because usually training our muscles during a full range of motion leads to more effective muscle growth, especially if we're getting in that stretched position at the bottom, because we build muscle best in the stretched and the middle position of the movement. For example, let's say a very bottom of a squat, in the middle of a squat is where we build muscle best. So that's where we should try and load our quads and spend most time. And in terms of what we should therefore look for in the movement, if we want to basically extend our leg and create as much bend in the knee as possible, is we want to pick movements that allow us to do so, as it will just mean, again, we'll take our quad through a large range of motion. And not only do we want to bend our knees as much as we possibly can, but we want to make sure that when we're doing so, we get our knee over the toe. And, or not over the toe, knee, we don't want our leg parallel to the ground, or not parallel, sorry. We don't want, let's say, we don't want a squat and we don't want our shin to be vertical. And the reason being is when our shin's vertical, there is minimal weight on the quad. And it's something that it's hard to explain, and it's something that you can't really cover very well in a podcast, but basically there's no tension, or there's little tension on the quad when your knee isn't traveling forward. If it's just directly vertical, there's not going to be a lot of the tension on your quad. It'll mainly be on your glutes and your lower back as well. So that's why when we're doing things like a barbell back squat, you don't want to have a vertical chin, basically. So we want our knee to go forward ideally. So this basically tells us what we can focus on when we're doing a squat is bending at the knee first and pushing our knees forward, so we're getting our knee further over our toe. As a result, targeting our quads better. And so as well as that, how do we manage to basically get our knee over our toe when we're not using, let's say, free weights or that? Something else to consider is when we're doing movements, we should try and focus on having a lower stance. And the reason being is, let's say you're doing like a leg press or a hack squat. If you stand and put your feet at the top of the leg press, go as deep as you can, you'll notice your knee doesn't go over your toe. Whereas if you put your feet at the very bottom of the leg press, as low as you possibly can without your heels coming up, you'll get your knee going further forward over your foot or over your toe. Even if you can't get your knee over your toe, you want it basically travelling past your heel. You don't want it not travelling forward at all. Even if you don't have that great range of motion in your ankle, some is better than none anyway. So just do the best you can. So yeah, all quad movements, you should really have your feet as low as possible on things like a leg press, things like a hack squat, things like a V squat machine or like a Smith machine squat as well. We want to have our feet quite far back, if that makes sense, so that they're right under the bar. Same with doing split squats as well. And again, like I said, this will just basically allow us to get more bend at the knee and get our knee to go over our toes a bit more, and as a result put more stress on our quad. Something else you could consider when you are doing like squat movements or movements to try and target your quads is the rest of your body supported. So not that it needs to be supported, but sometimes other things can fail before your quads. So that's why people can potentially say barbell back squats aren't the best for muscle growth, is because if, let's say, you're doing a barbell back squat and your back fails first, you're right, I can't keep upright, you know what I mean, you just feel like you're gonna fold over, then that's not your quads failing first, that is your lower back failing first, which we don't want, because if your lower back fails first, then you're still going to have room in the tank for your quads. Your quads still aren't going to feel exhausted. You're not going to be training your quads to failure. And that doesn't really make sense if we're wanting to get maximal development out of our quads. So of course, it doesn't mean you should just shouldn't squat, especially if that doesn't apply to you. And even if you do feel like you fail first because of your lower back, you can look into things like creating more tightness. You could brace harder, that sort of thing. So yeah, don't take that as just don't squat because it's bad for your quads, because it's not. And something else we want to ideally do is stay pretty upright if we are squatting. So when we think about a squat, if we are really bent over, meaning like we're not that upright, our chest is not that you should need to keep your chest up, but just pretend you're like leaning forward a lot during the squat. That's gonna put more load on like your glutes, your lower back again, and you won't be able to get your knee over your toe. So ideally we should stay quite upright when we're doing movements like a squat, and this can be done by simply focusing on, instead of pushing your hips back when you're lowering in a squat, instead focus on sitting down, trying to set your hips in between your legs. And as well as that, focus on keeping your chest up to an extent. You don't want to do it excessively so you're arching your back, and because that can run into issues and also mean you're not in a stable position. But it's something we can consider doing, just trying to focus on staying a bit more upright. And as well as that, we can potentially get more out of like a free weight squat by elevating our heel. So if you've ever seen someone with Olympic weightlifting shoes on, or shoes with like a heel wedge, or squatting with plates under their feet, the reason being is when we do that, what it basically allows us to do is, when we think about when we get to the bottom of a squat, you'll have more ankle mobility, because your ankle's raised. So it basically means you don't have to bend your ankle as much. And as a result, because you're not having to bend your ankle as much, you can basically get your knee further over your toe without running out of flexibility at your ankle. And that means you can stay upright to keep basically the weight over your foot, because obviously if the weight's really far forward, really far back, you're going to fall because it's out of your centre of gravity, because it's far away from you, so you can't keep balance. Whereas if you've got a wedge under your foot, it means you can get your knee far forward, you can stay upright and stay balanced while not working like your lower back as much, not working your glutes as much, because you're more upright. So that's why folk use like heel wedges or Olympic weightlifting shoes. The only problem I see if you're standing on plates or that is because it just feels sketchy walking back onto them if you are trying to do so. And next up, something else that you can do if you can struggle to get your knee over your toe or you've got poor mobility is work on it. Work on your ankle mobility. Just because something's poor doesn't mean it has to stay poor. You can get better at things, practice it. And it's not just about going in the gym and training hard, it's about doing the things like working on your ankle mobility to, as a result, be able to train your quads more effectively. And in terms of how to work on your ankle mobility, basically if you struggle to get a lot of bend at your ankle, if you struggle to get your knee farther over your toe, what I recommend is when you're doing movements like a leg press, when you're doing movements like a hack squat or a squat, focus on pushing your knee forward at the bottom during your warm-ups. Focus on spending time pausing there and feeling that stretch in the bottom position, because if you're not in that position often, if you don't visit that position, then how do you expect yourself to improve your flexibility there? So simply spending time giving your ankles a stretch out at the bottom of, like I said, a leg press or a squat can help develop that over time, while also stretching it outside the gym, outside the sessions, or even before your session, just focusing on doing a lunge and driving your knee forward over your toe. So yeah, just to conclude what I was talking about there, it's basically when we are trying to train our quads, we want a low stance. If we're doing a machine or something where we can influence our stance, obviously with a barbell back squat, you can't get a low stance because it doesn't work like that. You're not using a leg press platform or that. So yeah, we want ideally a low stance. You also, something I didn't actually touch on, you want a stance width to basically allow you to go as deep as you possibly can. So you might see people be like, oh, close stance to get the outer sweep of the quad, and wide stance to get the inner sweep of the quad, things like that, the inner part of the quad. I don't think you really have to stress about what part of the quad you're trying to work. Especially if you're listening to this podcast, you're probably not, you could be, but you're probably not mega experienced weight training. You've probably not done it for years on end, like 20 years, you're probably not. So you've probably not got an absolute ton of muscle in your quads yet. I think that's fair to say. So what I'd recommend is just focus on building quads. You don't have to focus on the fine brush strokes before laying the big ones. Focus on just the movements that will give you the most return, and just focus on building muscle before worrying about getting all the small details, if that makes sense. So yeah, basically you want a stance where you can go deepest with, because if you're going as deep as you possibly can during a squat, you're gonna work your muscles through a full range of motion. You're gonna get maximal quad development. You're gonna be able to recruit as much of your quad as possible if you're going as deep as you possibly can. So I wouldn't worry about your stance width to target a certain muscle group. Just choose what stance you can go deepest with. And like I said, you want to focus on getting a nice low stance width that you can go deepest with. You want to get your knee forward over your toe, and ideally remain pretty upright during, let's say, a free weight movement, and same with like a Smith machine if you want to target your quad. Also, before I finish, something that is a bit of something that doesn't quite apply is a leg extension. So you'll notice during a leg extension, you don't get your hamstring to touch your calf. You don't get full knee flexion. You don't bend your knee as much as you possibly can. So why would we do that if we want full knee flexion? So Leg extension, it's a bit different because it works your rectus femoris, which is a muscle in your quad, because your quad isn't just one muscle. It's got three, or you could say four. And the leg extension works the rectus femoris, and it basically fully shortens that muscle, fully contracts it. Like when you do it, you'll feel the squeeze. That's because the muscle's fully contracted, and you can't straighten your leg. You can't put weight on your leg when it is locked out, like the leg extension on things like a leg press or a hack squat, because there's no tension at the top. So that's where the benefit of leg extension is. It basically puts tension on the top and also allow you to train the rectus femoris maximally, because you can't really train that muscle during other movements, because you basically can train it best when you're bent at the hips. When you're sitting in the seat and like leaning forward is when you can contract it best and straighten your leg and put stress on that muscle when your leg's straight. So that's why we do leg extensions basically. And if you don't, then you won't develop that muscle maximally, which is why I have it in my program, which is why I program it for clients, as well as being an enjoyable exercise for some. And not that you can't build muscle without a leg extension or you need one for big quads, but I think you're holding yourself back if you don't potentially put it in your program. And yeah, so it's basically when our hip is like flexed or bent and our leg straight is when we're contracting that muscle, which is why we want to do a leg extension, because it allows us to do so. So yeah, hope this episode helped in terms of allowing you to work out how to train your quad maximally and train it best. So basically we want full knee flexion on the compound movements, we want a leg extension in there. So thank you very much for listening. Please like, share, subscribe, leave a rating and review if you can. It would be greatly appreciated, and I appreciate everyone who's listened to the podcast so far. And let me know any topics you'd like covered, and I appreciate everyone's time as always.